There are 5 men in Africa that have held on to power for nearly 2 centuries. That is nearly 200 years of combined rule. That's longer than most countries have existed as independent states. Yeah, these men are alive right now and still in power. We have Teodoro Obiang of Equatorial Guinea. He has been president for 46 years. Biya of Cameroon for 43. Yoweri Museveni of Uganda for 39. Denis Nguesso of the Republic of Congo for 41. Isaias Afwerki of Eritrea for 32. And here's what makes this story worth telling. They all started differently. A military coup, a constitutional handover, a liberation war, a democratic election, then a return by force. Different beginnings. But somehow, they all arrived at the same place. Power without end. And what makes this interesting is that the great defenders of democracy remain in partnership with these dinosaurs as they hang on to power. My only question here is, why? Let's start with the longest, Teodoro Obiang. He took power in Equatorial Guinea in a 1979 coup. It was violent, decisive, and according to him, necessary. You see, his uncle, President Francisco Macias Nguema, had turned the country into a nightmare. There were brutal executions, economic collapse, and a reign so terrifying that when Obiang overthrew him, people actually hoped things would improve. They were wrong. 46 years later, Obiang is still there. He is one of the longest serving non-royal leaders in the world, not just Africa. But how do you stay in power for 46 years? Well, first, you control the law. In 2011, Equatorial Guinea introduced a constitutional amendment establishing term limits. Sounds promising, right? Except the limits didn't apply to Obiang. The limits were structured in a way that still allowed Obiang to run again, and he has. Second, you make the state a family business. This is Obiang's son, Teodoro Nguema Obiang. Everyone calls him Teodorim. He serves as vice president. He is the heir apparent. He is also infamous for something else. Yeah, corruption on a staggering scale. He has been convicted of money laundering after diverting state resources into personal luxury. And while Teodorin shops for Ferraris in Europe, there continues to be widespread poverty in the country. Recent World Bank estimates put it around the high tens of percent depending on the poverty line used. The country sits on massive oil reserves, enough wealth to transform the nation. Instead, it flows into offshore accounts and foreign real estate. And if you speak up about this, that's where Black Beach Prison comes in. Torture in Equatorial Guinea is well documented by human rights organizations. Political opponents disappear, journalists are silenced. An entire generation has grown up knowing that questioning the president can be fatal. The regime occasionally makes gestures toward reform. Like in 2019, officials announced a draft law to abolish the death penalty. And yes, the country is a democracy. Elections still happen. Obiang wins with 93, 95, sometimes even 97% of the vote. But Equatorial Guinea under Obiang isn't an anomaly. It is the blueprint. Biya became president of Cameroon in 1982 through constitutional succession. His predecessor, Amadou Ahidjo, unexpectedly resigned and handed power to Biya, who was his prime minister. He accepted. He was 49 years old. Well, he's 92 now and still president. That is 43 years, the second longest serving head of state in Africa, the oldest head of state in the world, and increasingly a president who governs his country from hotel suites in Switzerland. Biya's absences are legendary. He spends months abroad while Cameroon deals with insurgencies, economic crisis, and a separatist war that has killed thousands. But before we get to the Swiss hotels, we need to talk about 2008. That is when Biya's presidency transformed from long-serving to potentially infinite. Cameroon's 1996 constitution included term limits, 2 7-year terms. By 2008, Biya was approaching his limit, so his party-dominated parliament simply removed it. They also granted Biya immunity from prosecution for any acts as president. This was insurance for forever. The response was immediate. Thousands took to the streets with a simple demand: let someone else lead. Well, security forces responded with live ammunition. By the time the demonstrations were suppressed, Reuters reported activists saying more than 100 people were killed, while the government cited far lower figures. The term limits were removed anyway. Biya has won every election since then. Meanwhile, Cameroon's Anglophone region have been engulfed in conflict since 2016. What began as protests against marginalization by the French-speaking government escalated into armed separatist rebellion. Government forces have been accused of extrajudicial killings and burning villages. Separatist groups have committed atrocities of their own. Thousands have died. Hundreds of thousands have been displaced. Biya's response has been largely military crackdowns. He frames the crisis as terrorism, and through it all, Biya remains in Europe for extended periods. His government insists he's working. Even within the ruling party, talks of secession are taboo. It is seen as challenging for Biya's authority to even imagine Cameroon without him. In November 2025, Biya was sworn in for another 7-year term. If he completes it, he will be 99 years old. That is, an entire generation of Cameroonians has never known another president. They've only known what it means to live under one. Yet, he has the support of Western defenders of democracy. And when we go over to East Africa, there is this guy who fought to restore hope to the common people in Uganda. In 1986, a 42-year-old guerrilla leader named Yoweri Museveni marched into Uganda's capital after 5 years of brutal civil war. His rebel army had just toppled a military government. Uganda had endured decades of chaos under brutal dictators like Idi Amin and Milton Obote. Museveni was hailed as a liberator. Well, it's 2025 now. Museveni has been in power for 39 years. The irony isn't subtle here. The man who warned about leaders overstaying became exactly that. And understanding how it happened reveals a pattern that repeats across this entire story. Uganda's 1995 constitution included a 2-term limit for the presidency. Museveni initially supported it, but as a second elected term approached its end in 2005, his party-controlled parliament voted to abolish term limits. Then came another obstacle. The constitution barred anyone over 75 from running for president. Well, no problem. Museveni was born in 1944. He would be ineligible for the 2021 election. So, in 2017, his allies pushed through another amendment removing the age limit.
I want this.
This one sparked unprecedented chaos. There were fist fights in parliament, protests in the streets, but it passed anyway. Uganda's Supreme Court upheld it in 2018. So, with legal constraints eliminated, Museveni faced the 2021 election against a new challenger, Robert Kyagulanyi, known as Bobi Wine, a musician turned politician. Bobi Wine energized young Ugandans with a simple message: it is time for a change. Well, what happened next exposed how far Museveni would go to retain power. In November 2020, security forces arrested Bobi Wine during a campaign event for allegedly violating COVID-19 restrictions. Spontaneous protests erupted in Kampala and other cities. The response was swift and lethal. Security forces opened fire with live ammunition. In 2 days, at least 54 people were killed. Most were unarmed protesters or just bystanders. Amnesty International documented the violence. The Ugandan government, well, it praised the security forces for stopping what they called rioters. As election day approached in January 2021, the government shut down the internet nationwide. Opposition rallies were blocked or violently dispersed. Bobi Wine, he was effectively placed under house arrest. When results were announced, Museveni had won with 58%. Wine contested the outcome, citing massive fraud. Well, he eventually withdrew his legal challenge after security forces surrounded his home and allegedly intimidated witnesses. And then there is the succession question. Museveni's son, Muhoozi Kainerugaba, rose rapidly through military ranks to become commander of land forces. He is widely regarded as his father's chosen heir. Although Museveni denies it, Museveni's wife, Janet, serves in the cabinet as education minister. Other relatives hold key positions. Uganda under Museveni increasingly resembles a family enterprise. And here's the tragedy of Museveni's story. He genuinely did bring stability after years of violence. In his early years, he expanded education, improved healthcare, and addressed Uganda's HIV/AIDS crisis openly when other leaders denied it existed. He contributed peacekeeping forces to Somalia and played regional diplomatic roles. But that credit has been exhausted by 39 years of accumulated authoritarianism. Museveni's 1986 quote follows him everywhere now. Opposition figures repeat it mockingly, and he's not even done. The next election is scheduled for 2026. Museveni will most certainly run again. Uganda, you see, has never experienced a peaceful transfer of power through elections. After 39 years, it still hasn't learned how. But how about this other country, Eritrea, that has never experienced elections since independence? Isaias Afwerki has been president of Eritrea since 1993. That makes him unique among these 5 men because he's the only president Eritrea has ever had. 30 years of liberation war against Ethiopia ended in 1991. Eritrea gained formal independence in 1993. Afwerki, the leader of the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, became president. He was a founding father, a liberation hero. The entire nation supported him. 32 years later, he is still there. And Eritrea has never held a national election. A constitution was drafted in 1997, containing provisions for multi-party democracy and human rights. It was never implemented. Political parties aside from Afwerki's People's Front for Democracy and Justice are banned. The legislature, judiciary, and executive all answer to him. In September 2001, a group of senior Liberation War veterans called the G15 wrote an open letter calling for democratic reforms. They were arrested. None have been seen since then. The same month, all independent media outlets were shut down. Journalists were detained. Eritrea hasn't had an independent press since that time. It consistently ranks dead last in global press freedom indices. But the most distinctive feature of Afwerki's Eritrea is indefinite national service. Initially framed as 18 months of mandatory service to rebuild the nation, it was extended indefinitely after war with Ethiopia reignited in 1998. Even after a peace agreement in 2018, Afwerki never demobilized the conscripts. Generations of Eritrean men and women have spent decades in forced military or labor service, and often with negligible pay. The United Nations and human rights organizations have described it as forced labor. Young people are conscripted at 18 and may not be released until their 40s or 50s, if ever. And leaving Eritrea without permission is considered desertion. Families of those who flee are sometimes jailed or fined as punishment. The result has seen mass exodus. By the mid-2010s, Eritrea ranked among the world's top refugee source countries, including 9th by UNHCR counts in some years. Tens of thousands risk death crossing deserts and seas rather than remain in indefinite servitude. In a 2008 interview, Afwerki told Al Jazeera that there would be no elections in Eritrea for 40 years or more because, according to him, elections aren't meaningful in the African context. Well, he wasn't being metaphorical. He was stating policy. For now, Eritrea remains frozen. A nation that fought 30 years for independence and then spent 32 years under the absolute control of the man who led that fight. Denis Sassou Nguesso's story is different from the others in one crucial way. He gave up power voluntarily, and then he took it back by force. Sassou first became president of the Republic of the Congo in 1979 through a coup. He ruled for 13 years during the single-party Marxist era, presiding over a state closely aligned with the Soviet Union and France. Then in 1992, in the wave of democratization sweeping post-Cold War Africa, Congo held multi-party elections. Sassou lost to Pascal Lissouba and he stepped aside peacefully. For 5 years, he was out of power. But in 1997, civil war erupted. Sassou returned with his private militia and support from Angolan troops. He seized the capital, Brazzaville, by force, ousting President Lisuba in one of the bloodiest conflicts the city had seen. Since 1997, Sassou has remained in power. If you count both periods, he has ruled Congo for approximately 41 years total, 28 years continuously since his return. After retaking power, Sassou organized elections in 2002. He won overwhelmingly after banning Lisuba's party and facing minimal opposition. A new constitution in 2002 included term limits, that is 2 7-year terms, and an age limit of 70 for presidential candidates. By 2015, Sassou was approaching both limits. He was 72 and he had spent 2 terms. Under the constitution, he couldn't run again. So he changed the constitution. In October 2015, Sassou orchestrated a referendum to remove term and age limits. Thousands protested in Brazzaville and other cities. Security forces, as usual, responded with tear gas and live ammunition. At least 4 protesters were killed when police opened fire on crowds refusing to disperse. The government imposed an internet blackout during the vote. The referendum passed. In the 2016 election, he secured another term with about 60% of the vote. One of his 2016 challengers, which is retired General Jean-Marie Michael Mokoko, was reportedly arrested and imprisoned on charges of undermining state security. Then in 2021, Sassou won again, this time with 88% of the vote. His main challenger, Guy Brice Parfait Colelas, he died of COVID-19 on the election day. The pattern mirrors the others. Elections exist, but the outcome is predetermined. Opposition figures who pose real threats end up in prison or exile. Congo-Brazzaville is an oil-producing nation. It should be prosperous, but instead, over 40% of the population lives in poverty. The reason is quite simple: massive corruption. A 2019 Global Witness investigation alleged over $50 million siphoned to offshore accounts linked to Sassou's family and associates. His son, Denis Sassou Nguesso, known as Kiki, has been repeatedly accused of embezzling millions from the state oil company. Sassou is now in his late 70s. Like others on this list, he's grooming his son for succession. Denis holds positions in parliament and was given a ministerial role overseeing strategic projects in 2021. Local media describe him as being positioned as a modern technocrat face for the regime's next generation. Whether the succession will be smooth is uncertain. Sassou rules through a network of patronage, rewarding loyalists from his northern ethnic base and keeping the military tightly under his control. But he is also old. When he eventually leaves power, by choice or mortality, the question is whether Congo will return to the chaos of the 1990s or whether his son can maintain the system his father has built. But now, how did these men manage to build this system that keeps them in power indefinitely? Well, here's the playbook. First, remove term limits. Uganda did it in 2005, Cameroon in 2008, Congo in 2015. Eritrea never had them to begin with. Equatorial Guinea made them irrelevant by ensuring they didn't apply retroactively. And second, control the security forces. Not just the military, but police, intelligence services, and parliamentary groups. Ensure their loyalty through patronage, ethnic ties, or shared history. When protests erupt, they are the ones who fire on crowds. Museveni's forces killed 54 people in 2 days. Biya killed 100 over constitutional protest. Sassou's forces shot protesters demanding he step down. Then thirdly, make elections theater. They happen, but the outcome is never in doubt. Fourth, suppress dissent completely. Independent media is shut down. Journalists are jailed. Fifth, position family members for succession. Obiang's son is vice president. Museveni's son rose to general and is widely seen as heir apparent. Sassou's son holds key positions and is being groomed for power. Turn the state into a family business that can be passed down. And the international community, well, it is often complicit. Western nations condemn these leaders' human rights records in speeches and reports. Then they maintain oil deals, security partnerships, and diplomatic relations. France still backs Paul Biya. The US works with Museveni on counter-terrorism. Companies invest in Obiang's oil. The rhetoric is about democracy, but the reality is about stability and strategic interest. Foreign courts occasionally seize assets, but the men themselves remain untouchable, shaking hands with world leaders at summits. Now, the uncomfortable truth is this. These systems didn't emerge by accident. They were built deliberately, piece by piece, over decades. And as long as they don't threaten Western interests, the illusion of democracy holds. And that is why we have these 5 men who have been in power for nearly 200 years.